Why is the sky blue? How do you cook pasta? What time is it? What's the weather like? What wild berries can I eat? Why do we exist? How would life exist on a planet without hydrogen? Our tendency as humans for questioning the world around us is what moves our society forward. From the earliest days of basic survival to our modern age of technology, philosophy, and innovative breakthroughs, questions are vital in shaping the world as we know it. But throughout time, there have always been those who tend to ask many more questions than the average Joe, and who do so with no real distinction between a useful question and a pointless one. These people just can't resist asking something, no matter what the situation. For these individuals, asking questions is actually a defining trait of their personality, and yet there doesn't seem to be a word to describe them. This situation, a gap in a language where there is no word to describe something that seems like it should probably have a word, is called a lexical gap. Besides someone who asks an excessive amount of questions, there are many more lexical gaps in the English language. These include things like the feeling you get right before a sneeze, a simple opposite for the phrase, thank you, or, as Hank Green pointed out in his popular lexical gap video, someone who isn't a virgin. These lexical gaps aren't common across every language, though. In our case, Russian has a word that is extremely close to the one we're searching for, pochamuchka. Unfortunately, this word only applies to children who ask too many questions, and in any case, it might be a little difficult to convince people to start throwing Russian around in their vocabulary. So, it seems like we'll need to create an entirely new word to fill our lexical gap. This may seem like a daunting process, but let's break it down into a few simple steps. First, who should we create this word for? Well, if we're talking about someone who asks an inordinate amount of questions simply because they can, to the point where it is actually an ingrained part of their behavior, then how about we target the new word at an audience who could really use it? Psychology focuses on the study of behavior and personality, and it seems like they could do with a concise term to describe this personality trait. Now it's time for the fun part, actually making the word. Of course, we could just throw out some nonsense word like flibberton or Yillamthuther, but that approach is incredibly lazy. Not to mention, it'll be difficult for a word with no connection to the definition we started out with to catch on. In psychology, many terms are something called a neoclassical compound. A neoclassical compound is a compound whose elements are taken from a classical language, either ancient Greek or Latin, and then combined in new ways in English. Psychology itself is a neoclassical compound formed from the Latin psyche, meaning animating spirit, and logi, which is from Greek logia and means a speaking, discourse, theory, or science. These two words were then combined, but the E was removed, and an O was thrown in to act as the interfix instead, the linking element between the two separate parts. Keeping that in mind, creating a neoclassical compound to fill our lexical gap seems to be a good way to tailor the word for our audience, and it'll make it easier to relate to its definition. The two Latin words I have chosen are cognitio, which means knowledge, and affectator, or zealous seeker of. Now, as we combine them, we'll have a chance to make some small alterations to anglicize the word to make it easier to say and use. So finally, we get Cognaffector, a concise way to define all those who cannot resist questioning anything and everything. To these folks, questions are asked excessively not out of any real interest, but out of habit. If you know someone who insists on asking questions about the most unnecessary detail of the story, or who won't accept even the most common knowledge without going to Google, perhaps even to the point of irritating those around them, then that person would be considered a Cognaffector. This habit of constantly asking questions has been around forever, but today's culture and technology make it easier than ever, and Cognaffectors are becoming more and more prevalent. Because this ability to ask questions and quickly receive answers is relatively new, psychology is yet to create a term for those who become addicted to it. Cognaffector would allow psychologists to better define and discuss this behavioral trait, thereby allowing them to better understand their patients and people in general. So the next time your classmate won't stop asking questions with no apparent point, or your friend insists on Googling how to boil water for the third time, don't get too upset. They're just Cognaffectors.